Hello and welcome. As you can see, I've gone back to this rather gorgeous, rather gaudy warp that I have on my little 8-shaft loom here. That is going to be a study in crackle weave that's going to be going onto my Patreon page, but I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later on. What I want to talk about today is I want to talk about warp thread weights and when it is appropriate to use them. And so many people using all sorts of things that are just ready at hand to weight the odd loose warp thread or false warp thread that they've put in on their weaving. And it could be a little container with some coins in, or it could be a little bag with some sand in. It could be all of those things, but I think that what we overlook is how important the correct weight for your warp thread weight is. Now, there are situations in which one would need a warp thread weight. The first and the most obvious would be this sort of scenario here, where obviously I've threaded up my pattern and I was one warp thread short when I made my warp. So purely and simply carelessness on my part. And there was more carelessness over here because you can see I've, on this green stripe, have got 2 extra warp threads. If you have an extra warp thread or an extra 2 warp threads in this case, and it's not going to affect your pattern, the easiest thing that you can do is simply take them out of the cross 6 and just hang them over the back beam and forget about them. If it's going to affect your pattern to do that, then obviously the fix becomes a little bit more complex, but I'm not going to go into that right now. The other thing that I need to point out is that even though I'm demonstrating on a table loom here, the methods that I'm using are perfectly suitable for rigid Heddle looms as well. So in this case, just to go back to what I was saying before I got sort of waylaid down an alternative path, if you have to put in a false warp thread for whatever reason, the best thing to do is to cut a length of the appropriate yarn, the correct length for your warp, and then these are the Ashford warp thread weights. These are absolutely brilliant because they give you the space where you can wind up that extra length of yarn, and then you simply take your thread around the bottom hook. Let me take a little bit more off. Take your thread around the bottom hook and around the top hook, and that can simply hang over the back of the loom. And I know that I can continue weaving with that with no problem. What is important here is the number of weights that I have on here. So if I just take those off, these warp thread weights come with a collection of little washes like this. And you vary the number of washes that you put on your weight according to the weight of your warp. Here I have a 5x2 cotton on my warp, and it's quite densely set. So I'm working under quite a tight tension. So for that, I've taken 5 little washes, and I just slip the 5 little washes on the top of the weight, and I know that it's going to be absolutely fine. On this little loom, on the other hand, I have an extremely fine yarn. This is a 16-1 silk, and you can see it's almost like sewing thread. My warp thread weights on this particular warp, because it is so fine and because it is so light, I only have 1 washer on the top of the warp thread weight at the back of the loom. If I had put 4 washers onto the washer at the back of this loom, that thread that I've weighted, wherever it is, I think it's over here somewhere, but that thread with the weight on it would actually pull itself out of tension, and when you take the piece off the loom, you would get like a little puckered stripe all the way up. So the weight of your warp thread weights is very important. Now, not all of us have the fancy warp thread weights. I quite often find that I use these guys. These are just little lead sinkers. Any fisherman will know exactly what they are and probably have some in his toolbox. And they're dirt cheap. You can buy them in any fishing shop anywhere. Now, I go for a 45-gram weight. And yes, these are weighed and measured, so to speak. So I use 45 grams. I find that 45 grams is actually quite a standard weight. It would be too heavy for the silk, but it would be absolutely perfect for the cotton. Now, one of the things that usually needs a weight at some point, especially on a harness loom, is your floating selvage. Now, your floating selvage doesn't have the same take-up as the rest of the warp, so it tends to get looser as you weave. But you don't need the extra yarn from your weight. You don't need any extra yarn for it. You just need something that you can clip in place and forget about. So what I do is I take one of these guys and I simply clip it onto my floating selvage, just like stays in place for the entire project that I'm weaving, and I don't have to worry about that anymore. Likewise, if you had a thread sort of in the middle of the warp that was misbehaving or just a little bit soft or a little bit floppy, an arrangement like that works brilliantly. You could, of course, also just use one of those warp thread weights. I don't have a spare one hanging around, but instead of having to wind all the yarn onto the spool, you could simply clip that in place and let it hang as well. But I do find that for the sort of the loose thread scenario, I find that the fishing weights are absolutely great. 2. This project, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be a Patreon page in May. You can find me on Patreon if you go and look for the Weaving Diaries or Weave at Brooklands or just me. This is going to be a study in crackle weave for 4 and 8 shaft weavers. And don't forget that I have the little plaid study, the little tartan blanket will be coming online on Patreon at the beginning of March. I'll see you next week with more hints and tips to help make you a more confident weaver. Thank you for watching.